What up, Wizards? It's Dev and the back of Chicken's Head. We are hanging out tonight, just having a cool one. I wanted to get on real quick and talk about something that I thought was interesting, and maybe I figured you'd think it was interesting too. So what we're going to do is talk about the top 25, real quick, just 25 cards from OTJ Thunder Junction that are already seeing play in Standard. Yeah, Thunder Junction's a pretty powerful set. 25 cards kind of sounds like a lot, but all of these have made their way into some deck that is placed somewhere in an MTGO challenge already this season. So, except for this first card on your screen right now. Honest, I haven't seen this in an MTGO challenge just yet, but we'll make it our honorable mention for the video, I guess. Why not? Simulacrum Synthesizer is kind of all over Arena in these kind of like Jeskai artifacts builds, and I played against them like a billion times already. I talked about that in the deck tech we just did. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's the deepest we've ever gone on a deck tech. It's good deck tech, but either way, I'll leave a link in the description. Enough pimping prior videos. Let's look at Simulacrum Synthesizer. If you haven't seen this quite yet, yeah, it's Cries 2 and it ETBs, but the good thing about it is that whenever any other artifact with mana value 3 or greater enters the battlefield, you get a construct, and these decks make like 10 constructs like super easily starting on turn 4, and they just have like 7 of them. It gets ridiculous very fast. So there's also kind of a combo version of this that uses Simulacrum Synthesizer and like Skitter Beam Battalion, amazingly enough, and it just puts like 30 power almost onto the table all at the same time. Even if you only paid 5 mana for the synthesizer, it's actually very, very scary. So cool deck, but the only actual result we've seen so far from it this season is from a tournament that's not quite finished as I'm recording this. I believe it's an Asian tournament. I want to say that it's a Chinese tournament, but I might be wrong about that. Either way, it's actually a really big tournament with a lot of entrants, and right now, Jeskai Artifacts is 2-0 in that tournament, and it's mostly based around Simulacrum Synthesizer. So hopefully that produces some results, but so far, we haven't really seen this card on MTGO challenges, but I wanted to give it a quick shout out. But I guess if we're going to call this a list, and we probably should, I kind of have put them in an order. Let's call Giza number 25 here. This has shown up in a few different decks, like 3 different decks, but they never do particularly well. You know, like Mono Black and Skeletons are both like kind of at the bottom of MTGO challenges this season so far, and I guess the best finishes we've seen with it are in Golgari decks. I saw it in a Dimir deck too, and Dimir is a deck that's like really trying out a bunch of new cards, but again, the most successful builds of Dimir have not really incorporated Giza, but she does show up. 24, I guess, is Bristle Bud Farmer here. I've seen this in like one Golgari deck so far this season, but it was like halfway up the standings in the challenge in which the deck appeared. So I guess I'll give it some flowers here. Only like 1 or 2 people trying this out this season, but it's a cool card. Like I don't want to get too far off track, but something I haven't talked about yet this preseason is I was thinking about this card the other day with Kellen, the Simic Kellen specifically, that lets you like attack with the Kellen, blow up an artifact, and if you control the artifact, you get to draw a card. So it seems like you make 2 food tokens with this guy, and you got a 5/5 trample, and then if Kellen attacks, you get to blow up one of your own food tokens and draw a card. Seems awesome, but also seems kind of good in Golgari with their sort of like mid to late game bridgey, like gain life off of food to stabilize against aggro decks kind of plan, because they get in with Restless Cottage and stuff like that. I guess maybe they figure if Restless Cottage is a good card, this is a good card, you know, but I don't know. I'm interested that it's already shown up a couple times, and I kind of wonder if it'll show up more this season. But I guess getting on to number 23 is Gold Vin Hydra. There's actually vein appropriately here of cards. I think it's like the next 3 that have all been tried out in Teamer Rage, but Gold Vin Hydra, I've even though I've seen it in like 3 Teamer Rage lists this season on MTGO challenges, and like all of these are going to come from MTGO challenges because they're like the only results we have at time of writing. There are a couple of big tournaments going on, like I've already kind of talked about, but we'll get to those in the next video. We talk about like the best new decks and stuff, which will be the next video. Hey, look at that. So reason to sub to the sandwich if you haven't done it yet. But yeah, this has gone in Rage as anywhere between like a 2 or 3 of, I think, from what I've mostly seen. And I'm really not sure how great the card has been in those lists. A lot of those Rage lists that this card ended up in are halfway down the standings and below. So even though a few different decks and probably some of the same users over the course of a few different challenges are trying this thing out, I'm not sure how great it's been, but it's worth noting that it has shown up. What is number 22 of Bonnie Paul, another Teamer Rage card? This is showing up in the sideboard of Teamer Rage, and I really, really like it there. Like a lot. Again, it's hard to say like how effective the card actually is, especially considering it's just a 1-of in those Rage sideboards, but I really do like the inclusion of this card. But 21 is Bristly Bill here. This is also a Teamer Rage card, and this is showing up in the main deck, which is kind of why it's above the other couple of cards. Like this is always at least a 1 of in the main deck, and I've seen it as a 2 of a couple of times. It's a really interesting include to like make your Nissa or Aftermath Analyst or just Bill itself like really huge. It's kind of an alternate plan to World Souls Rage because, you know, deck can fit a copy of this. It's got a couple of flexible slots, so kind of like the idea. I do. It's neat. I didn't make it big though, so maybe you want to actually be able to read it. I also like the double the number of +1/+1 counters mode because 5 mana sounds like a lot, but that deck gets to like 10 or 15 mana like really fast, like surprisingly fast. Especially if it has the green Virtue out, you can just like. You can probably activate this like 5 times, like pretty easily, honestly. So that's actually kind of disgusting. But moving on here, I guess to, what is it, 21? Something like that. 20. It's apparently 20. It's Honest Rutstein. Is that correct? Yeah, Bonnie Paul, Bristly Bill, Honest Rutstein. So I want to bring this up because it's the core, or one of the core cards of a brand new combo deck that looks really exciting. And we'll talk about like the deck more in the next video we do. Again, we talk about the next, like the coolest new decks in Standard. We have to cover this deck, but the basic idea behind it. And really, I should, again, use the word core, like the shell of the deck, because there's so many different ways to build everything on top of it, is just like Honest Rutstein and then the 2-mana Rona that like loots when you tap it and it untaps and you get a legend. That thing, and then Relic of Legends, the thing that lets you tap legends for mana. Keep in mind that with Relic of Legends, Summoning Sickness doesn't matter. Like your dude could have just came out and it can still tap for mana the way Relic of Legends is worded. So, and just effectively like loop Honest Rutstein over and over and over like infinite times. Tiny Bones Joins Up is the one that allows you to basically mill them out and kill them, I think, at the same time. Like I think the Tiny Bones Joins Up, they like lose a life. If I'm not mistaken, but you can also just mill them out if they have too much life. So we've seen Annie Jones up in a lot of these decks, and it's one way to generate like weird infinite like loops off of Honest Rutstein coming into play and like Rona untapping and all this stuff. So like there's multiple ways to go infinite in this deck. So that's pretty disgusting. And I think that if somebody comes up with like the right build of cards to put around it, then like suddenly we might have a pretty disgusting deck, because I think probably the best build of this deck is one that just has the combo in it, like incidentally some kind of Soul Tide Legends build or something with Slogurk, Nissa, maybe even to create a lot of fast mana. Like, who knows? You know, maybe some amalgamation of the Slogurk deck that did so well last season and the combo deck kind of incorporated into it just as like an ancillary win. I think might be really, really like a neat line to go on. So really interested in how this deck evolves, because there's like 4 different forms of it that have done reasonably well so far this season. Number 19 is Caustic Bronco, or I guess since we're in the Cowboy set, Caustic Bronco. Not a whole lot of people took real notice of this card over previous season, but it's kind of a dark confidant, like, in a way, I guess. It's been showing up in like Dimir lists and a couple of different Dimir lists. It's like a Dimir tempo with slip out the back and stuff like that, like shore up to help you keep your Bronco alive. And that's kind of neat. But there's also a Gix list, which is really, really neat, because Gix is awesome with this on 3 if you can get it through, which is kind of hard to do, especially on the draw. But like the dream is that you drop Gix on 3 after this on 2. You use Gix to saddle this up, get a big juicy thing off the top of your library. Your opponent loses a lot of life. You get in with the Caustic Bronco, you draw a card off the Gix, and then you win every game of Magic for the rest of your life. That is, of course, the dream, but like, probably not going to happen that often. But there's a lot of other stuff. Like the core of that deck is a Gix deck. You know, like Deep Cavern Bat and stuff on 2, and then Gix on 3, and it's just a good deck. So it's cool to add Caustic Bronco to it and get a little bit more like card advantage potentially, right? But it doesn't even have to like get in for combat damage to draw the card off of its own abilities. So I don't know. It's pretty cool. And there's a lot of stuff in that deck that like can potentially saddle it up. So just a neat card that I don't think a whole lot of people really saw coming. They're just like, it's another one of these. It's not that good, but it's doing like some light work in the early season, so it's worth bringing up. But 18 is going to be Legion Extruder. This is showing up not only in that Jeskai Artifacts deck, but also in like Mono Red randomly. Like a couple of other decks, like you see it in Anvil on Arena. There's like a red-white kind of Boros Artifacts deck that's been around for a while. It plays like Urbrass Forge and like random sweepers and stuff like that. And just tries to like leverage Urbrass Forge. But you'll see this in there every now and again too, because it has like random dinky artifact tokens and stuff. So kind of leverage the Extruder. Just altogether a decent card that's shown up in a few different lists, but usually it's just like a one of. in anything that's not Jeskai artifacts. And even in Jeskai artifacts, it's kind of surprisingly only like a 3 of. So, but it is definitely there. This is kind of where we start to round the corner into stuff that's seeing like a lot more play than just like random 1-ofs and sideboard play though. So let's move on to number 17, which is High Noon. Seeing some play in a kind of Jeskai-ish control deck. It's blue-white splash red, and the only reason it splashes red is to play High Noon and like sometimes Lightning Helix, but not always. We've seen this deck do okay in challenges, and often it'll play a second copy of High Noon in the sideboard. So that's kind of neat. There's not a whole lot of ways that I can see in these decks to like loop High Noons, but just another removal spell, and sometimes it'll help you close the gap, you know, so that you don't have to just like kill them with Restless Anchorage and dinky like Wandering Emperor tokens and Mirex. Again, like sometimes 1 or 2 extra turns and being able to just slam the door on them does help. So seeing a lot of this, and seen a couple of content creators play with it so far this season. It obviously does a lot of work against like anything aggro. So it's really, really good. It's like a 2-drop in Jeskai. And it sucks that you don't have to, like you usually you don't want to drop it on 4. You want to drop it on 2, but then you don't have like No More Lies mana or anything. You don't have like removal mana, but it's usually worth it to slow Boros down, if nothing else. And even like mono red, they can't like, play a guy and also Monstrous Rage, or Monstrous Rage and play a guy. So can slow them down a good bit too. So altogether, seeing a good amount of play here in the early season, and I kind of hope it keeps up. But moving on, what's next? 16, yeah, Dust Animus here. This is where we reach a glut of cards that's seeing a fair amount of play in blue-white control, which is trying to like evolve a little bit in the early season. And I will say blue-white, especially in the early parts of a season, always takes some time to evolve and tries a bunch of different stuff and throws things at the wall. Doesn't quite know what its matchups are going to be or what numbers it's supposed to use, or even if the cards it's trying out are good yet, right? But Dust Animus has been in a couple of blue-white sideboards that I've seen so far, and I can definitely see why, but you know, it hasn't done like all the work in the world. But as a blue-white sideboard card, it's definitely doing some stuff. But next is Demonic Ruckus. This kind of interrupts the blue-white cards, but we'll get right back to them. This has been in like mono red and a couple of main deck builds, especially the ones leveraging Slick Shot Show Off. We'll talk about that card a little bit more later. But this has also been in like at least one MTGO challenge red-white Illuminator deck that I've seen. So that's kind of neat. It's cool to give your Illuminator trample. Like trample double strike is gross. So it's actually a really, really sweet card in those builds too. But mono red's leveraging the card as well. Moving on though, I just need to remember what number we're on. I should have never made this a list. Number 14 is Avan Inspector, showing up in some like Azorius Tempo list, which is technically a new deck the way it's being built at the moment. It plays like Stoic Sphinx and like some counter magic, so it's like a weird hybrid between like a straight up blue-white control deck, because it's going to play a lot of the same removal and like counter spells and stuff, but also plays a fair amount of creatures. So it's kind of a newish deck, like Fairy Mastermind, Avan Interrupter, Stoic Sphinx. So it's like this flash plan, you know, that's just trying to close the door a lot faster than a traditional like blue-white control deck does in this format. So this isn't doing super well just yet, but it is showing up in like not a brand new build, but like an old version, like a new version of an old build, right? But moving on to Pest Control here. What number is this technically? This is 13. This is again in the sideboard of blue-white control, but we see this anywhere between like a 2 and 3 of. Great card to run against Boros, mono red, and a bunch of other like tokens-y stuff, right? So just cleans house and even cycles when you don't need it in those matchups. Rest in Peace is also in the sideboard of these blue-white decks, and even other decks. You know, I've seen it in the sideboard of Boros. So just as a sideboard card, if you're playing Plains and you don't care about your graveyard, this seems to like be a thing that a lot of people are on right now. So got to bring it up. RIP is like all-star freaking like graveyard hate. So good to have it in the format, and it's definitely worth noting. I think like as a direct result, I have not seen like Squirming Emergence or any other like Reanimator builds for the most part, right? Like Azorius Reanimator, the Helping Hand build, I've seen that like once, but aside from that, I really haven't seen like Reenact a Crime or anything like that. You know, like Insidious Roots hasn't really popped up. So absolutely stupid that Rest in Peace is a thing. Like graveyard decks seem like they'd be really good, and I want to do a bunch of like push pull stuff out of the yard, but Rest in Peace kind of, it's here, you know what I mean? But Stoic Sphinx is next. Just like mentioned this card, this is showing up in those like Azorius Tempo decks, but it's also like a one of and a lot of blue-white builds in the main deck, and then there's another copy in some but not all sideboards. So card's kind of getting around. this season, you know, we're not really, it's kind of seeing tentative play. Because even the tempo decks play like a 2-of Stoic Sphinx, right? Because they're all scared they're going to drop it and immediately get losted, you know? Like, if your opponent has any open mana, it's probably like not right to play this card, but like the moment they don't, it's kind of a banger. So cool card, and I'm glad that it is seeing some play. I put a fair amount of stock into this card in the early season. I'm glad that it's paying off just a little bit. But Final Showdown is next. I think this is the last of the blue-white cards for a while. Yeah, it is. This is showing up as a 1-of in like not every single blue-white main deck, but like 75%. Like 3 out of 4 decks are going to play a 1-of Final Showdown. And again, like I haven't really seen this in action yet, so I'm not sure how well it's doing in those lists, but it's seeing enough like universal play over so many lists that I'm sure that like people are fairly happy with it. You know, we've seen a couple of standard challenges. Final Showdown. We've seen a couple of standard challenges and a few like preliminaries. We've seen a couple of league events really since the season started, and we have these cards available to play on online. So, and through like those like 4 or 5 results that we have access to, Final Showdown has stayed a 1-of in these decks. So I do think they're kind of liking the Silver Bullet. But moving on to, geez, we got to be into the 10s now, right? Yeah, we are, man. It's number 9. It's Shoot the Sheriff. This is showing up in like Mono Black and Golgari lists even. Sometimes you'll see it in Dimir, and Dimir's doing like super well in the early days of the season. So, I mean, it was already like one of the best decks in Standard, if not the best, right? But Dimir has gotten like even more tools, and this is just one of them. And you'll often see this as just a 1-of in main decks, but again, it's showing up in like 3 different main decks as a 1-of, and I think it's doing like real work in those decks. Another boring piece of removal at number 8 here. Yeah, it's Scorching Shot. This is showing up in like every mono red deck. Not every, I shouldn't say every, but it is showing up in an awful lot of mono red decks. It doesn't completely replace Witchstalker's Frenzy. Sometimes you'll still see like a 2-of Frenzy, but a lot of mono red decks are just on 4 Scorching Shot right now. Like, yeah, 2 mana to kill Sheoldred, I'm in. 2 mana to kill Rafine most of the time, like I'm in, you know. So yeah, I just wanted to point this out again. Removal's kind of boring, but like these are definitely impactful cards. But number 7 is Harvester of Misery. Not really like, I'll say this is another removal spell for the most part, but it's not just a removal spell. It's showing up in some Esper lists, some Dimir lists as well, although not all. I think I've seen this in a total of like 4 lists so far this season, so it's not showing up everywhere, but it's showing up in enough main decks, and especially like really impactful decks. Like Esper and Dimir are still like the 2 best decks in the format right now, so definitely worth bringing up the fact that Harvester is like present in those builds, because those builds plays like 0 bad cards. Like they have no room for bad cards. So if they're playing Harvester, like it's definitely doing something right. I guess another card that applies to is number 6, Nurturing Pixie here. This is showing up in like every Boros list, because it turns out like basically every card in that deck, this picks back up and it does something else, you know. Like I'm not going to give myself all the editing in the world to do, because you know what all these cards do. It's like, it'd be faster to name the cards this doesn't work with in Boros. Like Gleeful Demolition, I guess this doesn't do anything with, but like, you know, Imidane's Recruiter, Novice Inspector, Voldaran Epicure, Sanguine Evangelist, just like every single card this can pick back up and like put back down to ridiculous effect, you know, whether it's just like another token with a 1-drop or Sanguine Evangelist, or like, oh, pick up my Imidane's Recruiter, you die. Like you can pick up Imidane's Recruiter with this card, and then for a total of 4 mana, like play Recruiter again that same turn, and Pixie flies in for 3. You get in for 3 with Recruiter. Like, it's so gross. It's like I thought this card would show up in a couple of decks, but I didn't really peg Boros to be like the deck it would show up in. But again, across like the last like few events that we've gotten access to in the early season here, Pixie's showing up in every Boros deck, but it's not a 4-of. It's just like a 2-of in every deck, but it's in like every Boros list. So like definitely take note of this card. Number 5 is like maybe surprisingly Lost Jite. This was like in my top 50 cards, but I wasn't sure about it. I thought it would mostly go good in Cookies, and like I've seen it in a couple of Cookies lists, but Cookies is dropping off a little bit. The sort of Simic Artifacts deck, or Bant, or Selesnya, or Zorius. There's like a million ways to build it, but it's a good deck one way or the other. It just hasn't really shown up that much in the early days. Instead, this is going in Dimir, and when Dimir finds slots for you, again with like the card quality involved in like every slot in that single deck. When Dimir finds room for you, like you're probably doing something right. And again, this isn't one that's in every Dimir list, but it's in just enough Dimir lists that like it is definitely a noteworthy card. But it's also showing up in Pirates. It's in like 2 different Pirate lists over the course of the last couple of challenges. And even though those decks aren't doing like super well, they're like in the 20s in terms of the standings, you know. They're still there, so I should probably point that out. Lost GT does look really good in the Pirates deck, but it's cool that it's showing up in Dimir. It does look kind of interesting to put on even like a Spyglass Siren or a Tiny Bones or something. So just a cool card. I'm glad that it is showing up. It did look pretty interesting. Speaking of Tiny Bones, by the way, here he is. Tiny Bones the Pickpocket is in both Dimir and Esper, but it's like always a 2 or 3 of, dude. Like they play a lot of Tiny Bones in these decks. It's kind of amazing, again, that with all the card quality, Chicken really wants in the room. She doesn't want out. She wants into the room. But anyway, with all the card quality involved in this thing, in those decks, sorry, with all the card quality involved in those decks, like again, the fact that they work in 2 or 3 Tiny Bones is nuts, dude. Card also shows up in Skeletons and like Mono Black Crime and stuff like that. So just a ridiculous card so far this season. Totally deserves to be like top 5 all day. And if this is in the top 5, like definitely some impactful stuff beyond this. But yeah, fear Tiny Bones. If it gets in like at all and you have stuff in your yard, it's kind of gross. And like it's so disgusting in the Esper list with Rafine like dumping counters onto it. Like, God, it's good. But next is 3 steps ahead. This is, I guess, appropriately number 3. This is showing up as a 4 of in like every Azorius control list. And again, like they had to cut some things to make slots for this. But some of the cards they cut were like pretty predictable. Like no deck plays Quick Study anymore. You just play this. But you know, Selesnya Toxic is also like cutting some cards some of the time to make room for 2 copies of this. I really think is interesting. We called that a little bit, but I wasn't sure it was like a serious thing that people would try. But yeah, it turns out like counter target spell, create a token copy of Rod Priest is just a ridiculous blowout, dude. So it's in those decks too, but especially Azorius Control is just a go-to snap playset that everyone's on right now because it's just so ridiculous, dude. Cryptic Command at home, you know, like Sublime Epiphany, but like way better, like actually playable Sublime Epiphany. So just, yes, very good Magic card. But number 2 is Slick Shot Show Off, showing up kind of everywhere in mono red and like making mono red a thing again. Everyone thought Is It Prowess would be the thing, and it is showing up like a little bit in the early days, but not as much as I think a lot of people would have thought. But when it comes to mono red, a little bit of Boros and especially Gruul even. Slick Shot's just in like all of these kind of prowessy, I play spells to protect my dudes, kind of just go off and kill you on like turn 3. There's the Twinferno, I think it's Monstrous Rage Twinferno combo, and they just take like 1 billion, like they almost die in one time. I think it's like 13 damage or something. With a Slick Shot Show Off, and this can all happen in like 1 turn for just a couple of mana if you've got this plotted. So yeah, just a super dumb card. We all knew it would. It wasn't a hard call. It would be. It wasn't a hard call to make, but it is showing up like kind of in the numbers that we all considered it would. But what's better than this? Duelist of the Mind so far, dude. This is in like every Esper list. So stupid with Rafine, first of all. Very dumb with that card. Good on turn 3 to curve into Rafine with, because it's just going to get like a decent boost in power the next turn, because you'll connive. It'll get counters from that or whatever. But it also gets power because you connived in the first place and drew the cards. So Vigilance, so it's like Wandering Emperor proof. Just fantastic turn 2 creature here in Esper, but also pretty good in Dimir, right? There's a bunch of ways to draw cards in that deck. Good in like anything control. I've seen a couple of like Dimir control lists try to leverage this card. It's also in a couple of other lists for that matter. I've seen a sort of Proth's Eidetic Memory in another deck that uses like Ledger Shredder. So it's kind of popping up everywhere, but definitely again, like the most relevant lists that it's in are Esper and some Dimir lists, but definitely way more Esper lists. And it's just like really overpowered in those. And again, super massive, like card quality in the Esper deck already. So like why like the fact that this can show up as at least a 3 of in like every Esper list since the very beginning of the season is kind of like really impressive, because they really didn't have the slots to burn. But you know, that's it for now as far as like the most. Hold on. But yeah, as I was saying, that is all for the top 25 cards from OTJ actually see and play in Standard at the moment. But remember, bunch of big events. Now you want away from me. What's that about? Bunch of big events this weekend that are still kind of popping off. We'll get results from them late Sunday night. And then early this coming up week, we'll be talking about like the top 3 new decks in this standard. And I've already got a couple of decks I got my eye on, right? But then shortly after that, it's Pro Tour time. And I've been hearing some rumblings that a couple of pros are working on some like real new technology, and I'm excited about that. But there's a lot to cover in standard already and like coming up in the very near future in this season. So it's pretty exciting so far. OTJ has already introduced a buttload of new cards into standard, and there were a few I didn't quite get a chance to cover. Maybe it could have been a top 30 or whatever. So just let me know how you felt about everything. If you're surprised about some of these cards showing up, or you're surprised hasn't shown up so far and all that stuff. I'm interested in your comments. But aside from that, YouTube stuff, do it, call to action. They tell you to do this. I don't know if anybody listens, but please like the video. It just takes a second. Please, come on, just give it a quick like, and maybe other people will see it, you know. Aside from that, you can sub to the channel. I'll usually say sandwich, but screw it. Sub to the channel. I don't mean actually go and sub to a sandwich. I mean sub to my YouTube channel right now. Aside from that, you can also support on Patreon. I'm not going to tell you to do that right now, but if you have an extra $1 a month laying around, it supports the channel like you wouldn't freaking believe, and you get to vote on what content we do. Got another poll coming out probably Monday afternoon, so if you want to participate in YouTube history and vote for the next deck tech that we do, get over to the Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description. $1 a month. You know it by now. Why haven't you done it? Anyway, that's all I got for this one. That is, of course, Allski Kowalski and Itzky Lewitsky, so I'll see you down there in the comments, and I'll see you in a couple of days with the best new decks in standard. Now she wants out. Love you guys. I've been Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.